Well, there we go. That's what I was waiting for. So, uh, welcome everyone to FCYO's Youth Core webinar, Healing, Support, and Transformation, Supporting Young People's Needs While Organizing. We would like to start with just having folks introduce themselves if you haven't already. You can use the chat feature that's here to tell us your name, your organization, where you're from, and one question that you have about youth organizing and providing holistic supports. And you can keep doing that while we're getting started. A little bit of background about this webinar series. So this webinar is part of FCYO's Youth Community Organizing Resource Exchange, or Youth Core project. And the goal of Youth Core is to provide regular opportunities for youth organizing groups to come together across issues, across geography, across organizational forms, to learn from each other and to share strategies on how to build power. So Youth Core includes these regular webinars, a national convening that some of you may have attended in Durham in November, and we're now in the process of planning the next convening and some additional opportunities for groups to continue to share with each other. So a quick overview of this webinar. This webinar is focused on how youth organizing groups are offering a variety of holistic supports to young people while they organize, and how this is building a new model for transformative change and healing. So we'll start by sharing a few lessons from FCYO from our field scans. Then we'll hear from Carmen Iniguez of the Movement Strategy Center with highlights from their 2005 report, Bringing It Together. Then we'll hear from two youth organizers, Nicole Lee from Urban Peace Movement and Natalia Aristizabal from Make the Road New York, about how they are combining organizing and supports in their work. And then finally, we're going to share some resources, including a toolkit on incorporating services into organizing work from FCYO's Roots Initiative Toolkit. We'll take questions via the chat all along, and we'll plan to end in about an hour and 15 minutes. We realized that we had so much that we wanted to share on this webinar that it was going to go a little bit over an hour, but we didn't want to cut any of it short. Just a reminder about the tech notes. The participants, you will be on mute. You'll be on mute throughout, but you can use the chat feature to ask questions and make comments and engage with each other throughout. And so a reminder again, for those who haven't introduced yourselves yet, just take a moment to tell us your name, organization, where you're from, and one question that you have that you're bringing to this work. So the next thing that we want to do is take a quick poll to see who's on, and a little bit about the work that you're doing. We're going to paste. You can see a participant poll here. We're going to paste it now into the chat feature. The Fuse program that we're using doesn't have a built-in poll, but if you look in the chat, the latest chat from Will Buford has the link to a poll. So if you would just take a moment and indulge us to click to put that poll, that link into your browser, and you'll see a couple questions come up that will help us understand a little bit more about who's on, and how, and the kinds of supports that you provide. So if you just take a moment, fill out the questions. You can tell us, does your organization provide supports? Some major buckets of, if so, what kind of supports you provide, and then how do you mainly do it? You may do some of all of these, but is it mainly through programs that you offer yourself, mainly through formal partnerships with other organizations, or mainly through informal referrals? And if you then hit done, and then click the link that says see previous responses, you'll be able to see the responses. So far we have about 18 responses, and if you refresh the page, you'll see the new responses as they come in. So you can see right now, we have 31 responses. You can see that 83% of the folks say that they do provide some supports in addition to their organizing work. Most common there, 56, actually, I'm sorry, most common is employment at 64%. uh, followed by mental health and healing, now at 59%, academic support at 48%. So this is in, in line with the findings that we found in the past. But you can see that most organizations are providing a variety of different kinds of supports, but academic support, mental health and healing, employment among the most common. And it looks like most of this is done through in-house programs at about 53%, and then a mix of partnerships and informal referrals. So that's just helpful for us to see a little bit about who's on and the work that you're doing on an ongoing basis. So I'm now going to move on and just share a little bit about why we picked this webinar, why we think this is an important issue. We know that youth organizing groups across the country are doing amazing work and leading campaigns to fund schools, protect the environment, fight for immigrant rights, hold police accountable, and so many more different issues. But at the same time, youth organizing groups who work mainly with low-income young people and young people of color realize that many of the young people who are leading these campaigns are suffering from the effects of racism, poverty, and dysfunctional systems that they're trying to change. And many of the young people who are leading these campaigns may struggle with homelessness, dealing with abuse, or may need help graduating from high school or getting into college. Youth organizing and youth development are often seen as separate or sometimes even opposite approaches, as you see in this diagram where they appear on opposite ends of a spectrum. But when we talk to youth organizers from across the country, they recognize that if they're going to be successful, they need to find ways to meet young people's needs. And it's hard to organize if your basic needs are not being met. But we also recognize that if young people are going to become lifelong leaders in the social justice movement, they need stability in their lives. And they need support and healing as well. So some people might see this as a new approach. But when we talk to organizers, we hear that it really builds on a long tradition of organizing and including services that includes the Black Panthers breakfast programs and the legal and health supports from the United Farm Workers. So as more and more youth organizing groups have begun offering these kinds of supports, they're developing models that incorporate organizing and youth development and individual and systems change. And we believe that this is a really powerful model for social transformation. So a little bit about what we've seen in some of the field scans that we've done. Our 2013 field scan data showed that a vast majority of youth organizing groups provide some kind of service. Similar to what we just saw in the poll we just did, the most common were employment, academic support, arts and culture, basic needs, and mental health and healing. That we saw that people do this through a mix of in-house programs they offer themselves, formal partnerships with service organizations, and referrals. And we see that there's a lot of benefits in providing these kinds of supports. So because these organizing groups who understand people's needs in the context of systemic oppression that their communities are facing, that they've developed service and support models that don't just treat people as individuals with problems, but focus on healing and transformation, that we think that there's a lot that social service organizations could learn from this kind of approach. In addition, these groups are often able to reach young people that normal service providers cannot. Next, we think that this approach ensures that young people not only have the organizing skills, but have the stable lives that they need in order to take leadership in their communities for the long haul. Also, incorporating these supports creates sustainable organizing cultures that help prevent burnout and help young people want to stay in organizing for the long term. And finally, in a few cases, it can even open new revenue sources for youth organizing groups. And I just talked to a group yesterday that received city and county money to open a tutoring center which their members can use, but will also bring new members into their organizing work. And we think that this is something that actually could be replicated in more places, where youth organizing groups could become more sustainable by reaching resources that wouldn't fund organizing, but would fund the services and supports that they offer. So there's a lot of benefits to doing this work, but we also know that it's really hard work. And while a number of different models have been developed, finding the time and resources to support young people while leading campaigns is no easy task. So now we want to hear from a couple of the folks who have been doing this work on a daily basis. So first, we're going to hear from Carmen Iniguez, who is a longtime youth organizer and now works with the Movement Strategy Center team that's supporting youth organizing groups across California. And MSC did this great report back in 2005 called Bringing It Together. And Carmen, can you tell us a little bit about the lessons from this report and also just from your work supporting youth organizing groups?
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be on this webinar. On a personal note, because as you mentioned, I'm a long-term organizer. I started as a teenager, 14 years old, when I was in my hometown of Wilmington, California, and have done a lot of organizing work with young people across California. And I am now I'm a registered marriage and family therapist intern as well, in addition to the work that I do with MSC. At MSC, we're really interested in how groups move to a place of integration and recognizing that meeting basic needs and organizing for change are interrelated efforts that benefit both individuals and community. And the groups that are profiled in bringing it together present very different models for integrating direct services into organizational programs. Their organizational cultures, contexts, and structures are differ, and their capacities to provide direct services also vary. Some of the groups, as Eric mentioned earlier, work with like-minded social service partners, so they partner with outside agencies, and others have gone a different route and developed in-house programming, so providing either through alumni or through a paid staff member, but the services come from the actual organization. Regardless of the path, all of them found that their work was strengthened through the integration of these approaches. And they see that individual and community needs are interdependent rather than in competition for time and resources. All of the groups that we profiled identified the need for a holistic model for change, um, the need to take care of the totality of a young person's needs as their leadership and their engagement in social change efforts increased and developed. The six organizations that are profiled in the report are Youth Making a Change, or YMAC, in San Francisco, California, Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, or YMPJ, in the Bronx, New York, Youth Justice Coalition, YJC, in Los Angeles, California, the Center for Young Women's Development in San Francisco, which is now known as Young Women's Freedom Center, Lumi Cedar Project and Lumi Nation in Bellingham, Washington, and Latinos Unidos Siempre, or LUS, in Salem, Oregon. These six groups are diverse in terms of geography, issue area, race, gender, and immigration status of their members, and also are diverse in terms of their organizing models and their structural approaches. So I want to share some of the shared strategies and common themes that we saw across these very different groups. As I mentioned earlier, some of them provide in-house services. So some of the groups in the study developed organizational capacity to provide academic tutoring and college guiding counseling, as one example. Other groups developed relationships with academic organizations and school staff to access relevant support. Some of the organizations developed relationships with doctors and other healthcare providers to provide, sometimes for the first time, medical and dental and vision care for their members. These groups there's also groups who facilitate access to alternative medicine, such as acupuncture and herbal medicine, with like-minded professionals. Some of the groups brought in professionals to provide emotional, spiritual counseling to address a wide spectrum of issues, such as domestic violence, death in the community, colonization, oppression, and self-worth. Some groups return to more traditional ways, regenerating culture by bringing back ceremony and rituals to their healing and their support work. all of the groups saw the interconnecting of these elements as vital to building a sustainable and effective social justice movement. Organizations are bringing traditional ways and practices to their supports and services because they see this no longer as a should we do it question. It's more of how do we do it in order to truly sustain the transformation that we want to see in the world and in our communities. We need to start with the individual. In terms of counseling and ongoing support, and I know that the presenters after me will be touching more on healing work. An example, Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice in the Bronx offers ongoing access to both peer counselors and pastoral counseling. They make it a requirement that the young people participate in their wellness center, which is one of their four components, in addition to political education, organizing, skills building. The Lumi Cedar program in Washington recognizes the importance of dealing with historical trauma and the impact of oppression on their community and members. Some of their healing and support work is woven into the trainings that pass on Indigenous traditions that are based on a family relational model. Latinos Unidos Siempre, which primarily works with Latino youth, holds monthly gender specific healing circles, and they require ongoing attention to supporting family relationships during the time that the young people are participating. Um, the Center for Young Women's Development in San Francisco offered writing sessions, retreats, grief counseling, access to weekly healing circles, as well as massage and acupuncture services to their young members. One of the pieces that I really want to lift up, especially because it came up in the survey and time again, it's come up as one of the particular areas that is of important and need is academic support. For some of the groups, it becomes very clear that it is vital to provide academic support and tutoring for their young members. All of the groups work primarily with young people of color, most of whom struggle to stay engaged in an education system that continually marginalizes, excludes, and disempowers them. Organizing groups understand that supporting their young members and learning how to better navigate that system and assisting them in graduating from high school has tremendous benefits. In these ways, groups not only retain members as they're receiving support to go through high school and graduate and be college ready, but they also improve their members' life chances of outside of school and beyond the organization. An example is Youth Making a Change in San Francisco, who developed relationships with a college access program here in the Bay Area called Upward Bound to build relationships with college and university staff. Um, I'm realizing that I'm running out of time or have run out of time. So I want to just touch on two last points, if I may. One in particular is around the population specific and culturally relevant work. That an important shared theme among the groups that we saw is that making sure that their approach to service and support is population specific and culturally relevant. Generic programs are generally not helpful and may even further hurt the young members of a more social justice oriented organizations. And sometimes services are geographically not accessible, or sometimes social service agencies are not trusted because of their Eurocentric approaches to medicine and care. So, an example is of a partnership is that the Young Women's Center for Development, they had a standing policy that they would only refer young women to trusted individuals with a proven track record of being respectful and sensitive to the services of poor young women of color. Other organizations, had in-house services like youth ministries. And then just to close out, I want to leave on this particular note that ultimately the approach of integration is about a more sustainable movement for social justice. It's one that is less divisive and that doesn't require its members to sacrifice other parts of their lives. And self care is really about self preservation. it's in our best interest to cultivate a culture of wellness and healing at all levels of organizations. I know we're focusing on young people right now, but also in terms of line staff who work directly with young people, and management in organizations. We don't have time right now to get into vicarious trauma or issues of that nature, but it's really about self-preservation.
Great. Thank you so much, Carmen. That's really helpful. And again, the name of that study, and we're pasting it in the link in the chat, is Bringing It Together. It's on the Movement Strategy Center website, and there's a link to it here. We will give you all access to. We're pasting a resource list on our website that we'll share at the end of this webinar. So all of the studies that are mentioned here, you can download just a page that has links to all of the reports that we're going to mention here. So are there any questions that people have for Carmen about this, about the tools in the Bringing It Together report, or about other pieces of the lessons that they've learned in supporting this? Carmen, I see one question here just that says that, can you repeat the part about how specific the support has to be for young people? What have you noticed? Is it more, are they general supports? Are people providing specific kinds of supports? How do people identify what kinds of supports to provide?
It really ranges. I think the question is more, again, about what is the capacity of the organization. I think, I mentioned that sort of the overarching question is not do we do this, but how do we do this? And the next question is, what do we have the capacity at the moment now to start with? So, for example, Inner City Struggle does a very integrated academic support program. One of their victorious campaigns was around ensuring that all students had access to A through G requirements, the college requirements for university and state colleges here in California. Their campaign was about having access to it, and what they were seeing was that their own young people, were unclear about whether or not they were being registered for those classes. So they have a dedicated staff person who looks at their classes and makes sure that they are prepared for that. They have a study center. Other groups like Community Coalition also have spaces and dedicated time that they provide tutoring. COCO, as well as ICS, and a number of Bay Area organizations that I'm familiar with here for many years have also provided tours for colleges across California, and sometimes even going out of the state to make sure that young people have access to college and to the college readiness mindset. So it really depends on, again, what is the in the moment, what is the capacity for organizations. And over time, what we've seen is that groups have continued to deepen those services instead of just sustaining what they're doing. So everyone sort of started at a place of this is what we can do. We can help young people we can read their applications for universities and provide editing. We bring in alumni who are already in colleges, and they come and provide that service. They volunteer. So it really is more of a question of what do you have capacity to do right now? Where do you want to start?
Great. We have another great question from Wes Ware in New Orleans. Says, we do as much of these things as we can. We have a GED program because members ask for it. We're connecting with healthcare providers. We're even working with workforce development folks now, and we're holding more healing nights. But how do you navigate when youth come to your organization for all of their needs and then compete with one another to get access? Sometimes I feel like our most marginalized youth are in such dire, desperate need that they come to our organizations in hopes of being saved. And when we can't save them, or when they're not willing to do their part, they get upset and turn inward on one another, which hurts our organizing. I know that's a big question, but it's something I've seen in the last week, so it's fresh on my mind. Thanks, Wes, for, I think that's, we want this to be a space where people can kind of share those real sort of deep questions. So Carmen, do you have thoughts on that, on young people feeling like they need to be saved, and what to do about sort of the vastness of the needs that young people come with?
Mhm. I have to say that it's real. I mean, we are working with with the populations who are, they're fighting for the same against the same systems that are marginalizing them. And we can't run education campaigns or any other kind of campaign without addressing their needs in relation to that. And often what we find out is that their needs are broader than that, right? So my experience as an organizer at Californians for Justice was that our focus was education. But more often than not, I got young people coming to me around mental health needs, and that was not something that I had the capacity at the time to do or the training to do. Um, I think I think one way to answer that question is that it's going to take some time to get to a place where we can move to organizing work. So what we saw with these groups was that oftentimes it was a parallel process, that they were providing services and running campaigns or developing young people to run campaigns. And we also saw that the impact was that sometimes the organizing work had to take a different pace because the needs were so big. Um, I liken this a little bit to bringing on new staff members. Anytime that you bring on new staff members, you need to slow down enough to bring people up to capacity. You need to invest the time and the resources, and at times it might feel frustrating, or it might feel like, we brought more people on because we wanted to move faster, but I think we need to slow down in order to move fast, and that can be uncomfortable. In terms of competition for services, I think it really just speaks to the great need that there is. And I think that there's some really great groups here on the chat. I'm looking at Jamile from Rise, the youth center in Richmond, that does a really good job of creating a culture that is a supporting culture. They offer services there as well as organizing, and they've figured out a way to really make sure that there's a culture and culture keepers that are young people that are helping to shape, when people come in and help to meet young people where they're at.
Excellent. Thank you, Carmen. I see a couple of other questions that I one about doing cultural and indigenous practices and mixed race groups, and some about, like, if your organization isn't providing these services yet, how do you start? And I want to move on to our next speakers, because I think that the next speakers in the toolkit that we're going to share at the end, I think will really speak towards those questions. But I want to just encourage you all. We really do want this to be a space for people to ask the real and challenging questions. We know that you all are on the ground doing this work, working with young people who are leading amazing fights and also struggling with real issues at the same time. And we want this to be a space for people to really share those challenges and share what you're learning and the successes that you're having in doing that. So Carmen, thank you so much for sharing all that. Next, I want to introduce our next speaker. That's Nicole Lee, is the executive director of the Urban Peace Movement in Oakland, California. And Nicole's the author of a report called Healing Centered Youth Organizing, a Framework for Youth Leadership in the 21st Century. So Nicole, would you tell us about how and why you've been incorporating healing work into your organizing work? And let me make sure, Nicole, are you on? Can we hear you now?
I am on. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I know we had some problems with the video, so glad we were able to get you on by audio. Yes, we can hear you.
I am, yeah. Excellent. Okay, great. So, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Lee. I'm the director of an organization in Oakland called Urban Peace Movement. I'm also an Oakland native. And we do youth organizing. We were started around the crisis of community violence that Oakland faces. We were started in a year. We actually started as a project under another nonprofit in a year when Oakland had 148 homicides in 1 year, and we only have about 400,000 people in our city. So that was one of the highest rates of homicide in the country. And one of the young men in our program at that time told me that he had attended 13 funerals in 1 year of people that were his age. And so, this is not unlike what's happening in other parts of the country. And honestly, I grew up in Oakland, and it's been happening since I was a teenager myself. So I was trained as a conventional organizer, and I think actually doing adult organizing work. And the model that I was trained in was very focused on sort of outcomes, numbers, policy wins, and campaign wins. And, like Carmen was talking about, didn't really have a lot of room to attend to the whole person in the process of organizing. And that's not to undercut that model of organizing. One of the things I think is a very real challenge for all of us, whether we're doing adult or youth organizing, is the fact that we're up against opposition that has hundreds of times more resources than we do. And it's really like a David and Goliath kind of situation. So it's not like we have lots of time and lots of money and lots of staff to do all these things. And so organizations are put in positions where we have to make real choices about what we do with the limited resources we have. And so in the sort of model that I was trained in, the more traditional model, it was really about okay, all the resources all the time has to go into winning this campaign. I think youth organizing, as I became a youth organizer, that began to shift somewhat, although youth organizing is also focused on, it's important for us to win. So I don't want to diminish that. It's actually, that's one of the main goals why we exist, right? But I think that as a youth organizer, one, I think that we just have a different way that we view young people in some ways, right? And two, out of necessity, there would be times where I think all of us have had experiences where we're in a meeting and we're trying to talk about a campaign and a young person just can't participate, or there's something going on in the back of the room. And we come to discover that, maybe a young person had a sibling deported recently, or maybe somebody, knew someone who was killed, and here you are, you have a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old in front of you who is facing something that someone their age shouldn't ever have to face. And so out of necessity, I think our models have changed, right? I think we've had to incorporate all of the kinds of supports that Carmen talked about out of necessity. So in terms of, I wanted to talk for a second about what I think we mean by this word transformation that we use a lot when we talk about this model. For me, I think this gets a little theoretical, but there's a couple things. One is that I think I've come to see as an organizer that there's a relationship between hopefulness and empowerment. And I talked about this, a couple weeks ago at another presentation that actually some of you guys are probably at here in Oakland. But, I think the more hopeful we become as communities, the more likely we are to engage in social change and in effective social change. I also think organizing, just period, organizing the old model, the new model, the traditional model, whichever model, at the end of the day, organizing is an act of self-love. I think for many people, organizing is a moment where we realize, you know what, I'm worth fighting for, and people in my community are actually worth fighting for, and our lives matter. And so to me, there is also a healing component. Organizing in and of itself can be part of, and is oftentimes part of, a person's healing process. So I think these things are kind of reciprocal, that we have to build healing into our organizing models, but also that we have to acknowledge that organizing itself can be part of a healing process. The other thing that I think is a little theoretical, and then I'll talk about some of the things we actually do, is that for me, the word transformation, I look at kind of like the work of, Grace Lee Boggs, who passed recently, talks a lot about this, and actually a lot of people, elders and healers, are starting to talk about this, that there's kind of this new reality, or emergent reality, some people say, that's trying to be born into the world. And in order for us to have it come into reality, or to, in other words, to manifest it, we as humanity have to become more present, more centered, more inspired, and actually do what our heart calls us to do. And so the way that you do that is by engaging in healing processes. So it's almost counterintuitive. It's especially for social justice activists, we want to change the world, right? That's why we've dedicated our lives to doing that. And often we go first to trying to change all of these things that are outside of us. And I think that while we're doing that, in the process of doing that, we also have to, once in a while, take a step inward So I'm not saying we shouldn't be engaging in, policy change and fights. We definitely should do that. But we also have to occasionally take a step inward, because there is a power that comes from the inside of us that we don't fully access. And so it's like we have a tool in our toolbox and we're not using it. And meanwhile, we're trying to get all these other tools like money and more staff and more organizers and all these other things. But there's like something that we already have that we're not even using. So to me, it's about trying to acknowledge that there's an emergent reality, and that part of our job as social change agents is to actually manifest that reality. And I think you do that through healing. So some of the things we do, we actually do, traditional practices with multiracial settings. So that was interesting that there was a question for that. I would say number one, I think that all of us as organizers and, people that are leaders in our organizations and in our fields have to engage in a healing process ourselves. We did a project in Oakland. A bunch of youth organizations got together, and we launched this project last year called Healing the Healers. And so basically what we did is we brought on 4 facilitators who are both cultural healers and have a background in clinical mental health, professional sort of clinical mental health background. And the facilitators held 4 cohorts or 4 circles that met regularly for 6 months. And the circles were comprised of youth workers. So people who are organizers, case managers, people basically who are, we believe, to be really the front line of care for young people in the city of Oakland, many of whom don't access traditional mental health services, right? But they talk to their organizer. And we throw these folks in, our staff, mostly young adults of color that work in our organizations who, are activists and get policy stuff and get organizing. And the next thing they know, they're sitting with a young person who, had a best friend murdered. And they don't have, the tools. Our organizations don't train them in mental health services, and they're kind of winging it, So we created this project to try to create healing circles for those folks so that they could then better support the young people that we work with. One of the participants in the evaluation of that project said, how can you teach someone to heal if you have never learned to heal yourself? So I think for me, the first thing is we all need to start engaging in self-care and healing practices. The other thing is I would say, these things have to be held in a way that have cultural integrity. And, Maestro Jerry Tail, who's one of the foremost, sort of experts and, sort of master healers, who is from the National Compadres Network, often talks about that, the circles, the healing circles and the practices we lead have to be done in a good way. And when he talks about that, what he means is held with a pure intention. And so, we don't have to be perfect. None of us are going to be, many of us are younger. We haven't been doing this work for 50, 60 years. But as long as you sort of keep it within a good intention, I think that's really key and really important. I also think we need to reach out to elders in the social justice community and healers and enlist them to assist us with this work. So, in Oakland, we have the Brotherhood of Elders, and we also have the Compadres Network here in California. And so often social justice groups, really work with, have really made a relationship with healers in order to do the work. Some of the practices are simple, right? You can do like collages and vision boards. In one of our programs with young people in high school recently, we did a session on self-love, and we made self-love collages where you kind of like envision the things to be true about yourself and that you're proud of yourself for, and that you love yourself for. I also think hip hop has been, in the youth movement here in the Bay Area, a huge tool that we've used both in our organizing and also in the process of healing, because it gives young people a place where they feel like they can be fully self-expressed, and it doesn't look like, a counseling session. Right? It's in a form that feels really authentic to them, and allows them to have, to find their voice. And then I also think then we use that as a way to kind of, you can use a hip hop rally to put pressure on a target. So it also becomes an organizing tool. Yeah, so I guess I'll end there, but those are some of the practices that we engage in. I can't say enough about sacred circles. I think that's a really important practice. And you know, we can talk more about that later, but that's a practice that I think is widely used in youth organizations throughout California.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to our third speaker, and then we'll take questions for Nicole and Natalia as well. But let me go ahead and introduce Natalia Aristizabal, who's a longtime organizer with Make the Road New York. Natalia's been there for over 11 years as a youth leader and organizer, and now as the lead organizer. And so, Natalia, can you tell us a little bit about how you all provide supports to young people in the midst of the many campaigns that you're leading?
Sure thing. Thank you, Eric, for the intro, and thank you to Carmen and Nicole for your presentations, and obviously everyone who's listening to us. So my name is Natalia Aristizabal, and I'm with Make the Road New York. I have been organizing with youth since 2005, and what organizing now looks like for me, it's a little bit different because I'm more in the support area of our work. But within the organization, we have the Youth Power Project, which is the project that is designed to help and engage young people in New York. We are in Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and Long Island. And we are a very organizing center project. And so the sustainability and the support that we aim to do, we do it within our organizing project. And so some of it is more structural and some of it is more organic, but I'll share with you some of the practices that have worked with us. The project has been up and running since 1999, so we've had years of successful integration of young people into our project and activating organizers into the world. The first thing that I want to talk about is I may be talking or highlighting a lot immigrant youth just because that's my primarily experience, but it's not limited to immigrant youth. It's actually, as experience has showed us, it's relevant to all the young people who are growing up in the U.S. And you know, and they just face different issues, but are all facing extreme hardship. And so one of the first things that we do is talk about where we come from, right? So for example, for immigrant youth, a lot of it is coming from another country, learning a new language, perhaps being undocumented. A lot of our folks are undocumented, and we can't continue or expect to engage effectively young people in all of the campaigns that we do if we're not talking at first what's impacting them, right? So it's huge that we talk about identities, right? And then when we engage those conversations of identities, it is obvious that there is intersections, right? So like the main campaigns that we work with within the Youth Power Project are anything that has to do with immigration rights, police accountability, and educational justice. And so when we're talking about identity with our folks, so you know, perhaps they just migrated to the country, or maybe they're second generation. So there's the conversations around language, but there's also the conversation around whether they're Black, right? Like, what if they're Black and undocumented, or what if they're queer and undocumented? And so, you know, making sure that we're talking about what that feels like, what that looks like, what it looks like to be Black in America as a growing up in New York City and being poor in the schools that are accessible to this population, right? And so making sure that we are reinstating that it's okay for us to look the way that we look, that we have accents, and that is beautiful, and that we have complex lives, and that actually also makes us beautiful and culturally rich. We also like to do in our spaces when we're doing campaigns and we're talking about organizing, you know, a youth educator will say that a process is more important than the outcome, and obviously for organizing that's not necessarily true. So what I want to say here is the process is as important as the outcome. And so when doing projects or when doing campaigns, making sure that we are thinking proactively and intentionally about the young people that are in our space and what are the strengths that they hold. And we also especially because we work a lot with undocumented folks, realize that it's important to create different roles and identities in which young people are highlighted for that's different from where they come from. And so what I mean is, for example, if you have a young person that's all the time taking photos, can they be the photographer for the action that's coming up? And so her role or her title from there on is the photographer, right? Like, can we have young people who are the editors? Can we have, and so thinking about the work that we're doing in creating different roles that access different leadership traits to this, it also highlights that young people have other qualities and talents that they are in the process of developing, and that they're super important, and that we are in a space where we're highlighting those talents and ideas, versus perhaps the history or where they come from. And so that doesn't totally, like other folks have shared, addresses all the other issues and needs that they have in their lives, but starts developing this other identity that's based on skills, right? And in building skills and building that leadership. Not all young people are, good to talk to people like in public or do public speaking. So making sure that we just have roles and we're thinking about constantly about those young folks. The other work, or the other regular activity that we do is open mics, and we do open mics with the idea of making sure that we're creating a space where people are sharing what they're thinking. We want to hear what's happening through their minds, and often at an open mic you can learn more from a young person that perhaps sometimes they would share with you. Although, again, if you spend a lot of time with young people, you'll end up knowing a lot about them, or and what's happening in their life. But poetry, or if folks are emceeing or hip hop, it just allows them to express themselves in a different way. And making sure that we have open mics that are constant, it makes sure that they are sort of working towards a date, working towards a deadline. And often, because that becomes like a really awesome and enjoyable space, they're always prepping sort of their next piece for the next session. And we've also realized that that has made young people who perhaps at some point were not talking to each other talk to each other, because they're like, oh, you're coming from the same background. But it's a place for expression. And then the other pieces, depending on our budget, that we do is retreats. We do 1 or 2 retreats a year, again, depending on the budget that we have, where we like to bring young people to the countryside. A lot of the young people that we work with, when they go out with us, is probably the first time they're seeing a mountain in New York, or that they're leaving their neighborhood. So providing that space, and there we make sure that when we're opening up the space that we're working together, we create altar. And so we tell young people ahead of time to bring an object that means strength to them, and that it's a piece of, whether it's historic from their family or something that they created, but it's something that talks about that resiliency as community. And when we're opening up that space in that retreat, we do it in an altar, and we make sure that young people are sharing why they brought that object. And so we also have that space as a place where people would go to if they're having a hard moment, if they're missing somebody in their life. Sometimes when you're doing one thing, it would trigger another emotion. So making sure that young people know that what they need to move forward in life, it's actually at their reach, right? And that we can create the spaces of support and of strength within our working space together. And it doesn't have to be like these foreign concepts, right? So making sure that we're sharing that this is accessible to them, and that there's community, right, that also heals each other. And so this is one way that we do it. And then the other pieces that actually, one more piece that we do have, we do it both ways, structurally and more organically. At one of the schools or the buildings that we're in, we have been able to create something that's called the Student Success Center. And what that is a model where we teach young people who are seniors to help their peers to apply for college. And so finding out that young people really like talking to other young people, and the young people have all this strength, obviously, and the knowledge to be able to be peer educators. And so in the summer prior to that senior year, we train them about what the college application process looks like, so that these folks are ready to help their peers. And that happens inside of the school. And then we bring some of those workshops to the organization. And so we have that at the organization as well, workshops to help young people access or apply for college. And in that process, it's important that we either help them also with the financial aid, or we help them access scholarships, especially for undocumented folks who financial aid is not going to be accessible. I want to highlight that helping folks with college application is a very time consuming process, but it's super needed, because again, because of the population that we work with, we realize that a lot of the support they don't get at home. So if we're not supporting them in this process, often the schools that they go to are overcrowded, and they're also not going to get like the best support there. And at the organization, we have a space available for young people. We usually have sessions twice in during the week, but our space is always open for young people to come in. So we also provide a space where they can go to after school if they want to do work. This is the piece that's more organic. Like we will, leave a little bit of the work that we're doing to try to help them with homework. But definitely what we make sure is that we create that safe space and that open space so that young people know that they have an alternative when they get out of school, that they can also go to the organization, that they were going to find snacks there, they're going to find people who are willing to share space with them. And often sometimes that's what people need, a space and somewhere where they feel like they can belong to. And the last piece, this is organizational. This is not just within the Youth Power Project, but we do have a workforce development team that helps specifically youth over 18 who have working papers, or obviously green card and citizens, help find either jobs or trainings. We've realized that for some folks, is more in their mind is more achievable to go to a training that's 3 to 6 months in carpentry, interpretation, like just different skills. And at the end, they will end up being ready to take a job that's perhaps 15, 20, $25 an hour. And it was an alternative to college, right? And for some youth, especially the youth that come from families where they have to work right away, that just seems like an alternative that's more accessible to them than applying for college. But this is more or less some of the stuff that we do with our youth doing organizing campaigns.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So let's now take questions that people have for either for Nicole or Natalia. Any questions that people have for them, you can start to paste them into the chat. So there's a question here about how do you create the balance between the demanding needs of advocacy and the services that young people already need for themselves and their families. So how do you think about that balance between what you're doing in your organizing work and your campaigns and the many needs that young people and their families have? Natalia, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. I think that is a really good question, and it's a question that I don't know that it has an easy answer, to be honest, because the way that our campaigns are set out is that there's always work that needs to get done, and the way that life happens is that young people have, issues and things happening to them at all times. So one of the things that we have is we are accessible to young people pretty much almost at all times. We often coach young people to um, get to the answer that they need in their lives. Meaning, when you speak to a young person, you don't say, yes, that's what you should do, or I think that that's what you should do. You do guiding questions so that that young person arrives to the answer that best fits them. And often that actually is a lot of support, because if we can all go back to think when we were 14 or 15, life in general just seems overwhelming. And being able to talk to someone about what the outcomes of certain decisions would mean, and the impact that would have in someone's life, it's often very helpful. And obviously the other piece is connecting young people to the services that they need. So at the organization, we do have a health team and a legal team, but if we didn't have it, I would make sure to have a list of resources where they can go if they need healthcare, if they need mental services, they need a shelter because they're being kicked out of their home. And so making sure that we're pairing up young people to all the resources that are out there. And sometimes that also looks like calling them the next day saying, did you go to your doctor appointment, or did you go to your shelter, or do you need a Metro car? Can we get you a Metro car? Questions like that.
Right. Nicole, did you want to speak to that as well?
Sure. I mean, I would agree that that's the challenge, is that we are all so under-resourced and we're trying to do all of these things. I actually, wanted to kind of respond also to the question about like having the expectation of being saved, because the reality is that our organization, it doesn't do people a service to set up a dynamic where, where the expectation is that we're going to save people. One, we don't have the resources to do that. And secondly, it doesn't set people up for success. So, but it isn't like there's no manual on this. There's no chart where you can say, oh, you only go 25% and they have to meet you. Like, it's really on a case by case basis. We have one of our programs is an African American young men's circle called Determination. And the facilitator is actually an IFA practitioner, spiritual practitioner. So he brings some African-centered spiritual practices into the work. But he also does what he calls care coaching, which sounds very similar to what Natalia is describing, where he really sits down and tries to come up with a plan with young people. And, we often have to come up with money for young people if they have nowhere to stay for a night. But the problem is, right, we know we can't pay for them every night for the rest of their life or even for the rest of the month. And so if we can scrape together out of our general operating money or some donations, $100 for a young person or $200 for a young person, we need to know where they're going to be staying next week. You know what I mean? Like, are we going to be back in the same situation again? So I think that we have to do some kind of triage emergency stuff, but we also have to coach young people and really try to piece together all the resources we have access to as a community, right? Including people in our personal networks that might let somebody stay in a room, or or the services that exist in our communities, right? And often young people need advocacy in order to successfully navigate those services, right? Because if we just send them sometimes to an organization, that organization might be overwhelmed and they might get lost in the shuffle. So we actually have to go with them and help them advocate to get their sort of case on the radar screen in many cases. And it is, to be honest, it's a lot because our organizations are also trying to, at the end of the day, we're trying to fight campaigns. We're trying to stop, displacement and gentrification. We're trying to stop mass incarceration. And so at the end of the day, we have to judge ourselves by, what policies have we moved, in addition to all of this kind of work. So it is a lot.
Last question. I'm wondering if each of you can speak to are there ways that providing these supports to young people, how has it strengthened your organizing work? Or has it strengthened your ability to actually win campaign victories, right? We can look at these things as being, in conflict with each other, but I wonder, do you see them as being in conflict with each other, or do you see it as something that supports? And if so, how has it supported your campaign work?
Well, in Oakland, there's a very direct thing, which is that we're facing, the tech industry is right up the street. Silicon Valley is right up the street from us. And so Oakland is a city that used to be predominantly African-American, after the 80s, really had an economic downturn, was hit hard, obviously, by the crack epidemic. You guys know all this about Oakland. And all of a sudden, the tech industry is moving in, all this capital is moving in. The jobs, for the most part, are not benefiting those of us who grew up in this city. And so if we don't attend to these things, we don't have an organizing base. Our base is moving to the suburbs. And so there's a very real thing in terms of, our communities are in crisis and we have to do work to stabilize them because people can't participate in organizing if they don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. So to me, there is a very real piece to it, is that our organizing base, our power comes from, our communities. And if our communities are unstable to the point where, if they can't even see tomorrow, it's very hard to do organizing.
Yeah, I would echo that and echo that and again, I wanna say that I understand that this is work that just takes a lot from us, but the more that we spend time helping our youth members and leaders in figuring out their life, I actually think that the more that helps us with the campaign. And so one of the first things for us is to make sure that the people who are working with community member students, youth from the street, are youth organizers who look like them and come from the neighborhoods that they come from and that are also directly affected by the issue. So for our work around immigrant youth, we have an immigrant youth, right? And actually we have right now 2 organizers and they're both DACA. What does DACA mean? That they are undocumented, and because of the executive action of Obama, they have a work permit that allows them to work. Otherwise we would have figured it out. But what I'm trying to say is that it's important to have someone who has had the undocumented experience work with undocumented youth. The same thing for our police accountability. Our organizer, she's Black. She grew up in New York City. She knows what it is to be with her friends and walk down the street and know that the police are harassing them. And the same thing for the educational justice campaign. And the more that we, like, I've sat with them and helped them apply to college, and so now they're organizing with us and they go to college and they know the value. So I don't have to be there always to tell other young people the value of college. Another youth organizer will do it. That, you know, this is just to call some examples. When we are willing to support our organizer because she's facing an eviction, right, and we're able to fight the eviction and make sure that she's staying at her house for 3 more months, it actually means 3 more months where she's going to be able to help us lead our campaign. And they're both related to each other, and they both feed each other. And there's no way I personally can be like, it's more important, organizing is more important than helping them in their personal lives, or the other way around. It's a mix or a dance that we have to continue as long as we do this work.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you, for sharing all of that. We really appreciate it. If folks hang on for a couple minutes, we want to share some concrete tools that we think people can use to help identify how to provide some of these supports in their organizations. And if you look at the chat, we'll just paste it in a link to our website, to a list of resources and tools that are available. And I would also say to folks on the webinar, we know that many of your organizations do fabulous work and have a lot of tools that we don't know about. And please, if you have tools that you're using, go ahead and paste them in here and share them. And we'll find we'll collect them and share them out with different folks, and so that we can create a clearinghouse for people to share some of the different kinds of tools that you use. Because we know that many of your organizations have found a lot of different really amazing and valuable practices. So one particular tool that we have at FCYO for groups that may be new and starting to think about how they want to offer these supports is from our 2007 Roots Initiative Toolkit. And it includes a 5-step process for groups in figuring out how to integrate services and organizing. So the first step is familiarize yourself with the common definitions and activities of youth organizing and youth development. So this tool is really built around understanding how youth organizing and youth development principles can fit together. And so the first tool, and here's a screenshot of it here, just lists some of the basic definitions and components of youth organizing and of youth development. And I'll just do a quick walkthrough of some of these tools now so that people can have an understanding, and we'll make the link available for people that want to download it. Step 2 is assess the youth development needs of your members, as well as your organizational capacity to do the youth development work. So this assessment tool is designed to walk you through a planning process of integrating youth development into your organizing work. And it begins with an assessment of the particular development needs of your young people that takes into account their particular experience of oppression. And then the next section is an assessment that encourages you to reflect on how your current organizing has the potential to integrate the youth development activities into your organizing. And then the final section walks you through a reflection on the particular youth development programs you would like to develop, as well as an assessment of your actual capacity to be able to do that. Then step 3 is to understand the progression of youth appropriate organized, to understand the progression of appropriate youth organizing and youth development activities as members develop. So this tool provides a method for thinking through the different stages of youth development and youth organizing work. And we know that young people are always progressing in their development. And this ladder gives you one way to think through those stages, beginning with youth organizing and youth development activities for new members and ending with activities for experienced longtime organizers. Then the 4th step is to find ways for the youth development work to support your organizing and for the organizing to develop your members. So youth development and youth organizing should not be dealt with as separate activities, but activities that work together. So the integration of youth organizing and youth development helps young leaders to both develop as organizers and to build a healthy life. And so here, this is an integration tool that walks you through the major components of the organizing process, the base building, recruitment, campaign development, and gives examples of ways in which organizing can be used to carry out youth development objectives. So it provides a space for you to reflect on how you would want to integrate youth organizing and youth development into your organizing model. And then lastly, it is to develop a work plan for an integrated youth organizing, youth development program, right? So to go back and look through these different processes and figure out, all right, what's practical, what's a way we can start, and what's the dream of where we want to be. But ultimately, what I'd say is valuable about this tool is the idea that organizing and supporting young people's holistic needs, whether that's through emotional healing, whether that's dealing with with physical needs, or whether that's providing academic support, that those supports and organizing actually don't have to be separate from each other and doesn't have to be an addition, but how do you build kind of a holistic model that integrates them together? And so there's a number of tools in this Roots Initiative toolkit that can help you sort of think through how you might integrate those things together in your own work. So we have a toolkit and that's available for that you can download off our website, and we'll just paste it in to the chat, a link that has all of the resources for the reports that we've mentioned here. So we'll just take a couple more minutes. Are there additional questions that anybody has about any of these tools? Or questions for the organizers here about how they balance these different needs in their work? Yeah, it was a question about emailing out. We can email out the toolkits, but we'll post it on the FCYO website as well. The resource list that we just described will be posted on the FCYO website at www.fcyo.org. Are there any remaining questions that people have for the speakers about any of these toolkits or about how people balance this work? Great. And I see that folks on here are connecting with each other, and are starting to identify people who are working with similar constituencies and similar communities, and finding ways to share with each other. So let me just open up to our speakers again. Are there any last any last lessons that you want to share for folks who are trying to figure out how to integrate this work? And Carmen, let me start with you.
Yes, I think what I wanted to just lift up, one of the last things that I briefly mentioned is the importance of folks who are doing this work also doing their own work on themselves, doing the healing work that you need to do. As I think what happens in organizing work is that there's a reason why we are called so passionately to be part of creating change, because more often than not, we have also been victimized, we have been marginalized, oppressed, and those things have a serious impact. Um, I would encourage folks to find practices that are best suited to you, whether that is therapy or healing circles or writing or being in nature, but something that you do on a regular basis that is about nourishing and feeding your soul. Um, because you are important to this work, and you also are the models to the young people who are coming up in this work.
Excellent. Natalia, how about you? A last thought or lesson you want to share?
Sure. I want to say that I absolutely agree with everything Carmen just shared. I think I want to add is for folks who, like, I heard some of the presenters and I said, and I think to myself, damn, we need to get there, right? But perhaps what I said for some other folks is like, damn, I need to get there. And so I just want to also highlight that this is a work in progress, and that it takes a lot of, continuing to try, but making sure that we don't stop trying to figure out what it is, the support that our young people need, figure out how to do it in a sustainable way. Like Carmen said, figure out what practices are the ones that work for us. For example, we started doing, when the weather permits, to doing walking meetings, because sometimes walking meetings allows you to physically burn some of that anxiety that an issue may be creating. And so, you know, like sometimes it takes a little bit of time for us sitting down and saying, what does our day look like, and what different practices I can include, either by myself or with young people, that will help this space.
Great, thank you. Nicole, any last
Yeah,
thoughts?
there's actually some really amazing questions that have just come through. So one of them is from Janae Taylor, and the question is, how do we engage with young people who feel like healing work is too makes them too vulnerable? And that's a real issue, particularly in a place like Oakland, because when you grow up in Oakland, you're taught not to be vulnerable, that it's actually dangerous to be vulnerable. Um, so it is a very big contradiction to then say, oh, you know, you come in a room with people that you barely know and like tell all your business. That's a huge conflict for many people. So I actually think we have to build trust and community over time to do that. And establish what, you know, it sounds like so cliche, but safe spaces where people feel like they can actually disclose information to other people and not have it used against them. Um, and so to me, you know, Natalia spoke to this very eloquently as well. You know, healing starts on a foundation of relationships. And so it's really about, that's as important as like what actual sort of, you know, healing practices or tools we introduce, is really like, what's the community, the integrity of the community that we're building. The other question is, how do you make your own healing transparent to the youth? And I think the answer is you make it very transparent. And so, not in a way, though, however, that then you're dumping all of your trauma and triggering young people. But so I think that's the place where I think we have to be very careful. But I also think it's very important for us to disclose our own healing. Traditional, you know, Eurocentric mental health says that the practitioner never discloses, and that, in my experience, that doesn't work in our communities. And so I think that if you can say, look, I have been in a similar place where you're at, and I took a risk, and I'm telling you, like, this is what it's done for my life and my family's life, I think that makes a tremendous difference. So I think it's really important to disclose that. And the last thing is, there's a question about curriculum. Curriculum is very important, but you know, Maestro Teo talks about this often. You know, if you do curriculum, the danger is that then people sort of see it as the sequence of activities, and don't hold it in the proper intention. And so I think there should be curriculum, but I also think as important as the curriculum is what Carmen talked about in terms of people engaging in their own healing practice, so that they can hold a healing space for others in a way that has integrity, with their intention and cultural integrity as well.
Great, great. Thank you all so much for all of the wisdom that all of you shared to our speakers. We really appreciate it. And to those of you who are participating as well, many of you have really, we know that you all are living this work every day and have figured out a lot of amazing practices as well. And thank you for sharing those. So it's time for us to close out now. I really want to appreciate everyone for joining, and appreciate all of the speakers. Again, this is a link to some of the resources that we've mentioned that we've mentioned today on this webinar. They will also be available on our website, and there really are some valuable resources for many of you that's saying, you know, how do we do healing work, or what kinds of partnerships do we develop? You know, I think these reports, they have many case studies of them, of different organizations that really go into some detail about how different organizations have done this. You know, you can be in touch with different organizations, but some of this stuff has been documented, and there's a lot of lessons to learn there, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. So definitely encourage people to take advantage of some of these resources, but know that you will have to adapt it to your community. The needs of your young people are specific. The resources that you have in your organization, and if that Roots Initiative toolkit can be helpful to you in figuring out how to really adapt a model that fits the needs of your young people and the resources that you have available, you know, that's what that toolkit is designed to do. So please take advantage of a bunch of those a bunch of those resources. Also, please take a minute. We have a very short evaluation survey. There's a link here. We'll paste it into the chat. But if you could just take a quick minute to fill out the evaluation survey, we want to make these webinars as valuable to you as possible. We want to get your get your feedback about what works and what could be better and what topics you'd like to hear in the future. And we're going to be continuing to offer these webinars on a monthly basis. So please, it's a very short survey, but if you would just take a minute to fill it out, we'd really love to get your feedback. So again, thank you so much to everybody who joined. Thank you to all of our speakers for being on and for sharing so much wisdom with us. If you have other resources that you all want to share, definitely let us know and we'll make them available on our website. And take a look out for the next webinar. We'll be sending an email out very soon about next month's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thanks again, speakers. We really appreciate you all doing this. That was fabulous.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everyone.
All right, take care.